Good morning, and thank you very much for the opportunity to join you all. I am so sorry that I cannot be there in person. There's a long story why, and I will not bore you with that, but please know that if there was any way I could get back to San Antonio, I would. It's a real privilege to join this group, and I look forward to sharing a few thoughts with you, and then I'll leave it to the meeting organizers if folks have questions to send those to me, and we'll try and get answers back to you. So with that, if we could go to the next slide here, I want to be clear, and for those of you who know me, I will be pretty candid in my comments. They are my own personal comments. I'm not speaking on behalf of the chairman or of the joint staff here. And again, I'm happy to amplify it in my comments afterwards. Next slide, please. So many of you will recognize this building, and again, I'm not kidding when I say I really wish that I could be back in San Antonio, having spent 7 years there in the 1990s when I did my surgical training and worked at the Troop Medical Clinic there at Lackland, and then 2 more years there when I was the Vice Commander of the Air Force Medical Operations Agency. Really enjoyed the time that my family and I spent in San Antonio, but more importantly, very grateful for the tremendous partnership with the community, both at the medical level, but also at the political level, and the partnerships with the many different companies around San Antonio who support the military in so many important ways. The training that I got at Wilford Hall was world-class, and I say that not in an arrogant sort of a way, but when we looked at the graduates from Wilford Hall, they traditionally scored very high on their certification exams. When the training programs were evaluated, they were routinely recognized as some of the best in the country. And most importantly, when we went to war, we were ready. The experience that we gained at that Level 1 Trauma Center ensured that we were ready to take care of America's ill and injured. And that's really what I'm going to focus on today as part of this talk is, are we ready for the next conflict without Wilford Hall? Next slide, please. But before we get into that, let me say a quick thanks to everybody. Quick not because this isn't important or heartfelt, but because there's a lot of things to cover today. And I think it's important that we recognize that even though the last year seemed to be focused primarily on COVID and on other things, there was some great work by our military colleagues that occurred. So some of you may have been in Afghanistan back in the first 6 or 8 months of the year. And if you were providing medical care to our military personnel there, thank you for that. That was a nearly 20-year mission that concluded last year. And as we look at the data, we collectively provided outstanding care to the ill and injured who served there in Afghanistan. And we'll come back to that a little bit later on. Some of you may have been there also as we supported the evacuation of over 120,000 Afghan nationals. And I want to say that number again. The United States, in very short order, enabled the safe evacuation of 120,000 people over just a handful of days. There were 13 American service members who paid the ultimate price as part of that, and we should remember that that was not without tremendous cost to them and to their families and their units. And we should also be very proud of the care that we provided to the survivors of that attack at Abbey Gate and the care that we provided to those who were being evacuated. And we learned some valuable lessons about how hard it is to do an evacuation in those circumstances. And then some of you were probably involved in the care for those Afghan nationals, either at bases in the Middle East, in Europe, or here in the United States. And I want to say thanks for that, because their first touch with another country was on one of our bases. And what they saw were caring, capable, compassionate medics who leaned far forward to take care of people who, in some cases, had had no contact with a healthcare system up to that point in their lives. And then I also want to give a special thank you to those of you who were involved in the COVID support across the United States. One of the big lessons learned from COVID, and I promise we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about COVID in this brief, but this pandemic really highlighted what many of us have been saying for years. There's very limited surge capacity in the U.S. healthcare system. And as both President Trump and President Biden have separately noted, when our nation needs help, they turn to us. They turn to the U.S. military in many of these situations. And in this case, thousands of military medics went out to augment our civilian colleagues to help ensure that American citizens and residents were able to access the care that they needed during this very challenging medical and public health emergency. So thanks to all of you who are involved in that. It's something that's easy to say, but please know, having been deeply involved in this from the earliest days of the pandemic, and like many of you, deeply involved in our operations in the Middle East, the care that you provided, that outstanding care that you provided, our ability, your ability, to provide the right care at the right place at the right time is why we wear this uniform. Thank you for that. Next slide. So we've talked a little bit about what we've done over the last year, what many of you have done. Now let's talk about how we've been able to do it, and more importantly, what we need your help with in the future. So how did we do this so well? How did we achieve the lowest diet of wounds rate in recorded history? Well, part of it is we learned the lessons that our predecessors have captured and shared with us. And this is a really important point for all of us as military medics. We've got to go back and keep re-looking at the experiences from previous conflicts. This picture shows what's called a flying ambulance. This was created by Baron Dominique Leray, who was Napoleon's Surgeon General 200 years ago. Now, Dr. Leray was a surgeon, and as he was wandering around the battlefields of Europe, picking up casualties, and then he and his men carried them back to the aid stations, he watched the ammunition wagons driving up to the front lines, dropping off ammo, and then returning to the rear area empty. And like I hope many of you will do, he said, "That's stupid. We should not keep doing that." And he talked to Napoleon and to some of the field marshals, and they agreed to let the military medics use those ammunition wagons, which they renamed when they were being used for medical purposes as flying ambulances. So they would go to the front with ammunition, then they'd become flying ambulances, pick up casualties from the field, and bring them back to the rear area where they could get the care that they needed. This became the foundation for completely redesigning how Napoleon's army cared for its military casualties, and is really the foundation for how we continue to care for casualties today. So 2 key points on this. First, a lot of what we take credit for as being new, novel, or innovative expeditionary work is really 200 years old. Second, you've got to have the courage to speak up when you see stupid around you, because people are counting on us to continue to improve, not to just sustain what we've been doing for the last 200 years. Next slide. Now, there's been a lot of improvements along the way, and this chart kind of lays out how the survival rate has improved as a result of a whole host of things that we and our predecessors and many others have done, whether it's the introduction of antibiotics, public health measures, all the lessons learned on wound care. We could spend hours talking about those, and we should be very proud of that work. And we should remember that none of it just happened spontaneously. There were people, like here in San Antonio today, doing the deliberate research, collecting data, analyzing it to understand how we can improve. And I'll give a big shout out to our colleagues from the Joint Trauma System. Now that has become a truly joint capability nested under the Defense Health Agency, they've done absolutely phenomenal work looking across all domains at how we support all warfighters. And we should continue to nurture capabilities like that, where we take a hard look at what we should be changing next so that we continue to improve. Because the world around us, the threats we face, and the practice of medicine are changing rapidly. Next slide, please. Hopefully this will look familiar to many of you. This is a depiction of how we have delivered care really for decades now. And it starts from the point of injury, then we go to Role 1, Role 2, Role 3, Role 4 care. And we've gotten really good at this. We have tactical patient movement and strategic patient movement. This is one of the key foundations underpinning the high survival rate of the last 20 years. But I'll submit to you, this is probably not what we need for the next 20 years. Next slide, please. So we talk about we need to be ready, we need to change. Well, what do we need to be ready for? Again, you're probably gathering I kind of like to look back at history. So let's talk about World War II for just a second. Just before World War II began, so in the summer of 1941, just before the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, how ready were we? Because we did a great job by the end of World War II, but were we really ready at the beginning of the war? Now, obviously, I'm in the Air Force, so I've picked mostly Air Force examples here. But if we go to the upper left that shows that World War I looking airplane, you'd be correct. That is a World War I airplane. That was still in our inventory. Much like today, old equipment that we knew wasn't what we needed, but it was what we had. It was called a Keystone bomber, B-3, I think, that we still had in the inventory just before the beginning of World War I. We had started to buy new equipment like the B-17 in the lower left there, which was a much better bomber, much more capable bomber, but we had not quite figured out how best to employ or protect these new capabilities. And the picture in the upper right is from one of our bases in the West Pacific, where we had decided that because it was really expensive to have lots of security forces personnel or military police to guard our airplanes, we should put them all together as closely as possible when they were on the ground so that we could use as few people as possible to guard them. Unfortunately, this picture taken just before December 7th would have shown on December 8th all of those bombers destroyed by the Japanese, who were very grateful that we had thoughtfully put all of our bombers together so they could use the smallest number of bombs to blow them up. Great example of new technology that we did not understand fully how to use. In the lower right there, that's an exercise that was done in the summer of 1941. And yes, those are U.S. military cavalry personnel on exercise preparing for something. Now you got to ask yourself, do you remember any use of cavalry in World War II? And the answer is no. But we held on to the cavalry because we'd always had it, going back to the beginning of our nation. And we were unwilling to admit that it was the wrong capability for the combat that we were facing until we actually got into combat. So some things to take away from this. What are the things that we're holding on to today that we need to let go of? Things that we should be very proud of because of their contributions in the past, but that are no longer relevant. Are we employing new technologies the way we need to? And are we even capturing the new technologies that we need for future conflicts? Let's dig into that a little bit more. Next slide. We've got to ask ourselves also, are we ready for the threats that we know are out there? So the picture on the upper left is a picture of Mount Redoubt, which is a volcano in Alaska. Now, what the heck does that have to do with San Antonio? I put that in there because that was a real-world example when I was stationed in Alaska and that volcano erupted. Turns out volcanic ash makes it very unsafe to fly airplanes. You can't fly airplanes, you can't do just-in-time resupply, which we relied on in Alaska, and it also has all sorts of creates all sorts of problems for hospitals and other places where you need clean air. We knew there were volcanoes. Fortunately, there were some really good plans in place so that as soon as that volcano began erupting, the Air Force flew all of our aircraft out of there, and we then reverted to alternative supply chains. How well prepared are we here in San Antonio? I know there's been a lot of work on this, but I just highlight again, as we see more tornadoes and hurricanes and other natural disasters, are we really prepared? Have we done the exercises and the planning we need to do? And then are we prepared for attacks on our facilities? So the picture on the lower right is an apartment building in Saudi Arabia, which the Air Force had used for years. New commander came in Friday afternoon and said, hey, we've been here for years, I got it, but what's our plan if we're attacked? And they said, it's a great question, boss, but we've been here for years, we've never been attacked. And he said, all right, humor me. Let's write a plan, which they did that night, and they exercised it on Saturday, and on Sunday they were attacked. And most of the after-action reports really highlighted that plan, which then Colonel Doug Robb had directed be written on Friday and exercised on Saturday, was responsible for saving the lives of many of those who were wounded during that attack. Now, as we look at the national defense strategy, and as we look at what Putin is doing in the Ukraine, and as we look at the evolving threats that our country faces, we know that attacks on the homeland are not some philosophical thing that we don't really have to worry about. This is a real threat, with countries working very hard to build the capability to do that. Homeland defense is one of the core things that we as the military are here for. Are we ready as medics to support that if we have to defend our homeland? That's a question for each of you to bring back to your bases and think about. Next slide. And there's a host of other things before we even get to combat that we should be thinking about. We're so dependent on satellites in space, and yet we've seen the Russians and the Chinese working on anti-satellite capabilities. So what happens when we lose access to the internet? Now, unfortunately, we sometimes get practice with that because of problems with our networks on our individual bases or installations there. But this is a real challenge for us that we should be preparing for. The picture on the lower left is the Colonial Pipeline, which some of you may remember carries gas throughout the Southeast and the Mid-Atlantic, and it was taken down as a result of a cyber event. I put that in there because if that had continued, there were going to be medical implications as people were unable to get gas to drive to their dialysis appointments, and as hospitals and others struggled to get the fuel that they need. We need to begin thinking about these not as just academic discussions that somebody else can worry about, but things that we actually need to plan for as well. Picture on the upper right, some of you will recognize, that's 600 some odd Afghan souls on board a C-17 being evacuated. We talk a lot about China as our pacing threat and Russia as the acute threat, which we're certainly seeing in Europe right now. If we had to evacuate American citizens, are we prepared to provide the medical care as we do that? Again, something to take back and ask as you're working in your respective areas. Next slide. And there's a host of other things that we have to think about and that we think about here in the Pentagon. A couple that I'll really highlight. Advanced technology. So, I always chuckle because people say, I want some of that, what is that called again? I want some of that machine learning stuff, and I need a little bit of artificial intelligence. Get me some of that. We really are missing the opportunity to understand how powerful data is and how much data we have already. The tremendous data that we have within our electronic health records that could enable us to do syndromic surveillance to identify new outbreaks. The tremendous data that we have on the health of our force and our families to help us understand where we need to focus our efforts to improve the care that we provide. We've talked about cyber already. I'll highlight one other area, and that's in the lower left, and that's the anti-access and area denial capabilities that countries are building. We've had the luxury for the last 20 years of being able to fly in a C-17 or other aircraft to fly casualties out whenever needed. I had the great fortune of caring for casualties in Iraq at one point, and we'd have up to 3 airback flights a day. If we needed it, another plane showed up with great crews and took the casualties so we could continue receiving casualties. And in fact, our whole system now is designed to receive casualties, stabilize them so they can be evacuated. Well, we've got a problem because countries are now developing the capabilities that will prevent us from being able to do that on-demand air-evac. If we can no longer just stabilize and evacuate, that means we have to rethink what we do as far as medics to care for those who we stabilize and then have to hold on to. We'll come back to that in a moment. Next slide. And we've got to be ready for change. I talked about the cavalry a little while ago, and again, I'll pick on my own service now. The C-9 was a beautiful airplane. It was a nice commercial aircraft designed to move passengers between cities. And we loved it. We bought several of them. We used them for aeromedical evacuation, had beautiful paint jobs. They look great at air shows. And when it came time to look at alternative capabilities like the C-17, we fell hard on our sword and said that we cannot get rid of the C-9, which was absolutely untrue, as we've proven without the C-9. We've done a phenomenal job delivering high-quality care in the air using other platforms. We held on to this aircraft, though, because it's what we knew. It's what we were comfortable with, in spite of the fact that, as you can see from the picture here, it had this crazy ramp, which was almost impossible to get heavy patients up and down. And you had to land it on commercial airfields because it was only designed to land on commercial airfields. So you couldn't actually use it in expeditionary locations. And you couldn't refuel it by air because it was designed for short intra-city flights, or intercity flights rather, It was perfectly designed for short inter-city flights, which is not what we do in the military in a deployed environment. So other than the fact that we couldn't use it where we needed it, it couldn't operate where we are, and it was really hard to get patients on and off of it, it was a great aircraft. What are the things we're holding on to? What are the things you're holding on to today because it's what you're comfortable with, not because it's what we need? That's a question that only you can answer. But I would beg you, when someone shows you something better, please listen to them. Don't just fall back on, oh, I don't need anything better because I've already got whatever it is you think is so wonderful. Next slide. We've got to be ready for chemical, biological, and nuclear casualties. You know, when I give this talk in person, I ask for a show of hands of who has done an exercise in MOP gear in the last 6 months. And I'll tell you, it's disconcerting at times to see how few people have done that. And yet you've seen the open source reporting, the concerns about the Russians using weapons of mass destruction in the Ukraine. We know that North Korea and China and Russia have nuclear weapons. We know that multiple countries have these types of capabilities. We have got to make sure that we and our colleagues in the military medical community and in the communities and the industries that support us don't forget that we've got to be ready to take care of these casualties as well. That means we need better auto-injectors. We need antidotes for the new threats that are being developed by countries. And we need to understand what those new threats are that are being developed. Lots of opportunity for partnership with industry here. Next slide, please. I put this one in just because I had it in a slide deck probably from 2015 to 2019 and used to talk about, we've got to be ready for when the next conflict happens. And people kept complaining and saying, that really detracts from your brief. Russia's never going to invade Europe. You're never going to see that. It just makes you sound like some old cranky colonel at the time. You got to stop talking about that. Well, geez, what did Putin do on February 24th? He proved that our optimism was ill-founded. Our desire to focus on what we wanted to happen in the world didn't match his desires, and we're now seeing the consequences of that with the thousands of casualties in the Ukraine. We don't have the luxury of assuming that the world is going to work the way that we want it to. And we are the insurance policy for our country. We have got to be prepared when things go wrong, when people make the decisions that we hope they won't make. We can't count on hope, though, to provide the care that casualties need. We have got to be ready. Next slide. And there's a whole host of other things that we could talk about. In the upper right there, that's a reminder for me to talk a little bit about COVID as a great reminder of the threat of biological agents, naturally occurring or otherwise, and also the promise of some of the new technologies that are evolving, whether it's mRNA vaccines or nanotechnology. There's tremendous work that needs to continue to be done in the public health space to protect us from these emerging threats. In the upper left, you see hypersonic weapons that are being developed by another nation there. Again, our ability to understand the type of casualties those will create and make sure that our medics, our colleagues, are prepared to care for those casualties is part of our responsibility. And then at the bottom of the screen there, this is a picture of a swarm drone event. And you say, well, what possible medical issue could that cause? Well, as we're seeing in the Ukraine and as we saw in Ethiopia and elsewhere, the use of these remotely piloted aircraft or remotely manned assets is really a game changer. And we need to understand on the front end the human system interface between the operators of them. How many aircraft can you operate? How many of these platforms can a single person operate and control effectively? And then on the other end, how can we employ them for logistics, for patient movement, for all sorts of other things? And then finally, if they are weaponized, what do we need to understand about the threats that creates? All of those are questions that I hope you will help us to answer, not years from now, but now. We need to be answering those questions now. Next slide, please. So I've talked a lot about the things that we need to prepare for. What do we need to be ready for? So how do we mitigate these risks? What are the things that we need your help with so that we are ready to care for America's ill and injured when our nation expects us to do so? Next slide. Well, the good news is strategy is out there. So the new national security strategy should be released very soon from the president, laying out his vision. He put out an interim national security strategy early in his administration that laid out a very clear vision. The Department of Defense has put out a new national defense strategy just 2 weeks ago. And if you haven't seen it, there's a classified version, which I would encourage you to look at. And I know many people will say, oh, it's really hard to get to a SIPR terminal. I'm really busy. But if you really want to understand what we're supposed to be doing, what our nation and our department's strategy is, you got to read the strategy to understand it. So make the time if you truly care about what it is that we're asking you to do. And then the National Military Strategy, which comes out from the chairman, should be released very shortly. And again, once that's released, worth reading. Next slide. So the strategy kind of paints the big picture of what we need to be preparing for. Then we have to ask ourselves, what are the priorities in that? And I think most of us would say we went into medicine because our priority is to take care of patients. If that's not your priority, if you're in medicine for some other reason, man, I'd ask you to step back for just a second and figure out why patients are not your priority. And sometimes it seems like we're a little confused about that because we have been spending years arguing over roles and responsibilities and who gets to run MTFs and who should be doing this and who should be doing that. I'll tell you, my friends, if you step back and you say, what's the right thing to do for the patients who count on us to care for them? A lot of these questions get very easy. If you keep your focus on what you went into medicine for originally, to deliver great care to those who count on us to be there when they need us, it's really easy to prioritize where you spend your time and your effort. Next slide. And if you look again at history, you'll find that as we have gone to war now for over 100 years, we've fought as a joint force. So while we may talk about how this is an Army capability and that's an aircraft carrier for the Navy and the Air Force has this and the Space Force has that, the reality for us as military medics is we take care of a joint casualty stream. The majority of what we've done in every conflict, we've done jointly. We've done it with our allies and partners. This is a graphic from World War II. Now, it took us a while in each war to figure this out because we started off separately, and then over time we realized we were much more effective if we worked jointly. But by 1944, we had figured out that if we worked together, we could do a much better job of taking care of casualties. It shouldn't take us years of conflict and denied care for casualties to figure out that a joint casualty stream is best cared for by a joint casualty care team. You know that. I know that. We've demonstrated that for the last 20 years. The casualties don't give a darn what patch is on our uniform. They just want us to be ready to take care of them when they need us. Keep your focus on the patients. Next slide. And remember that not only is this about joint within our own military, but it's about joint with our allies and partners. And this extends beyond just the military space. You know, as we look at future conflicts and future disasters, we're doing more and more partnering with industries in other countries, with NGOs around the world, because none of us have everything that we need for every possible contingency. But together we are able to do extraordinary things if we are willing to partner. If we are willing to partner, to step away from parochial approaches and instead focusing on partners. And if you look at the National Defense Strategy, that's a big focus. The United States has always gone to war with allies. We should plan for that. We as medics should plan for that. How do we work with our German colleagues? How do we work with our Japanese colleagues? How do we work with our Korean or French or UK colleagues? We shouldn't figure that out when there's a patient in front of us. We should do that before a conflict occurs. Next slide. And there's some things that we figured out that we're going to have to keep improving on. So we know that fast care is really important. The timeliness of our interventions is really, really important. We've demonstrated over and over again that the golden hour is an aspirational construct, but it's the platinum 10 minutes that's really important. Having those first medics on the scene know exactly what to do and when to do it. You know, it floored me. I was at a meeting and someone came back and said, you know, that trauma critical care training, you know, that really interferes with all of our responsibilities at home station there. And we think that we don't need it every 2 years. We should do it every 3 years. I just about fell out of my chair. I mean, this is why we're in uniform, to be prepared for delivering care in combat. And if we're so committed to it that we only want to think about it once every 3 years, I'll go back to my earlier comment. Are you really focusing on the patient? Are you really focusing on what we as military medics need to do? Because it's hard to get this right. And it's, as I laid out a few minutes ago, it's going to be even harder in future conflicts. Getting that right care as quickly as possible means that people have to be very familiar with TCCC. They've got to be familiar with how to give blood products, because after tourniquets, the appropriate use of blood products is the next most critical intervention that we can offer. Are you practicing that in your exercises? Are you highlighting the importance of rapid care? If not, why not? What are you preparing for? Because this is what we know works. Next slide. Why am I so passionate about this, and why am I perseverating on this? Because unfortunately, we've got great data showing that while we improve dramatically during the course of each war, and what we as military medics do gets better throughout the course of a war, we quickly lose that knowledge after each conflict. And we've got great data showing this, that the low mortality rates of 3 or 4 years into a war are not replicated when the next war begins. But in fact, we go to higher mortality rates that then improve over time, usually because we're relearning the things that we forgot from previous wars. So my question to you is, are you willing to accept that we're going to get mediocre between now and when the next war starts? Are you willing to accept that the right time to learn how to care for combat casualties is when we're in the middle of a conflict? Or can our generation, and I'm near the end of my career, so it's really, can your generation of military medics, for the first time in history, preserve the capabilities and the knowledge that we've gained over many years of conflict in the Middle East, not lose that knowledge? Will you dedicate yourself to sustaining that ability to have the lowest possible mortality rates? Because if so, again, that helps to clarify your priorities of where you choose to spend your time and what you choose to exercise when you do your exercises and your training. Next slide. And as I hope you're discovering, or maybe discovering as I go through this, if I'm at least a little bit successful, the way we're going to deliver care in future conflicts is very different than that nice, methodical roll 1, roll 2 progression that we've all been accustomed to throughout our careers. You're going to have people who will go from a roll 2 to a roll 2, and you say, well, that shouldn't happen. They should only move to a higher level of care. Well, you know what? If you don't have air superiority and your roll 2 is full, you'll move them wherever you can so that you can continue to care for those who need it. And it may be that at times you'll go from a roll 3 to a roll 2 because that's the only place that has capacity to hold patients until they can be moved. Most importantly, because we know that we will have limited or intermittent air superiority, we're going to have to be prepared to hold patients for longer periods of time. It won't be stabilize and evacuate. It'll be stabilize, treat, rehab, and return to the fight. Completely different than what we've been training for the last 20 years. This is an opportunity for us to embrace the lessons of previous large-scale conflicts and make sure that we are ready for the next one. Next slide, please. Now, I want to make sure that I spend a couple of minutes on this because I think it is so important for us to recognize when Wolford Hall closed, for example, when other military hospitals have closed, we didn't have new ones that sprang from the earth. We are more and more reliant on our partnership with our civilian colleagues. And San Antonio is a great example of how that can work well. The partnerships that we have here are among the best in the country, and we've got to nurture those very carefully. We've got to continue to work with the University of Texas and with community partners so that we are part of the community resources that are ready to care for the community, and we get the experience, in particular, of taking care of trauma casualties so that when we do deploy, we are ready to do so. These partnerships are, I think, foundational to the future of military medicine. And so when people talk about, oh, we've got to really focus on MTFs and that's where we need to do everything, great. Well, if we can get more Roll 1 trauma facilities, if we can get more of our MTFs where we are taking the sickest of the sick and caring for them, that works well for us. But right now, in many of our MTFs, our number one product line is obstetrics. Now, I think obstetrics is incredibly important, and for all of my friends who are obstetricians or pediatricians, love you like brothers and sisters. But we don't do a lot of combat obstetrics, and we don't do a lot of combat pediatrics. We need those capabilities, absolutely. But what we really need is to take care of those sick medical patients, those sick surgical patients, because that's the unique skill that we bring to a combat environment or to a contingency environment. We also need obstetrics and pediatrics, but that's not sufficient. So if we can't get that in our MTFs, we've got to continue to build these civilian partnerships where we can get that opportunity. And whether it's with a civilian hospital or a VA hospital, I don't personally think it matters, as long as we are getting the sets and reps that we need, taking care of sick patients so that at home, so that we're prepared to deliver great care to sick patients when our nation deploys us to wherever we're needed next. And I want to say thanks to those in the audience who are from the community, who have been such great partners here in the San Antonio area, because this really is a benchmark here, Omaha, and a handful of other communities. Next slide. And part of what we're discovering as we think about future conflicts is we've forgotten a lot of what we used to know about how to do this. So throughout the Cold War, we had a plan called the Integrated CONUS Medical Operations Plan that talked about how we, the DoD, would partner with the VA and with community health resources, like I just talked about on the previous slide, so that when casualties came back, we would know where to send them and who was going to care for them. Well, that plan hasn't been updated in years because we thought that we'd never see that again. Turns out, again, if you read the National Defense Strategy, we do need to think about that. We do not believe that war is never going to occur again, and Mr. Putin is doing a great job of reminding us of that. So we are working very hard, and Northcom has the lead on this, in updating this plan that lays out how we, the Department of Defense, and many of you in this room, will work with the National Disaster Management System and our partners in the VA and in communities around the country. And San Antonio is a key node for this, as many of you I think know. So we look forward to your inputs on this as we move forward, and we look forward to your help making sure that we get this right. And then we'll exercise it and we'll continue to improve it so that whether we're taking care of casualties coming back, God forbid, from a war overseas, or we're taking casualties from a natural disaster here at home, we can say with confidence to the American people who rely on us that we are ready to take care of whatever our nation needs us to take care of, in partnership with all of those different great partners that we have across the U.S. government and in communities around the country. Next slide. Now, I haven't talked a lot about stuff, and people sometimes say, why didn't you talk about this cool thing that we're building and that cool thing? There's a lot of great work being done out there, and I want to highlight a few things that I think are particularly relevant to us. 3D printing has great promise, yet to be realized in the military, often because we're struggling to embrace it. But we need to look carefully at our supply chain and understand where can we substitute 3D printing for having just-in-time resupply. Because as I hope you're gathering from my comments, we're not going to have just-in-time resupply any more than we're going to have just-in-time air-evac. So how do we leverage these new technologies so that we can print what we need, where we need it, when we need it, rather than saying, gosh, I'm out of syringes or I'm out of whatever, and I have to wait for somebody to bring it to me. There's a whole discussion that we could have about supply chain management in the 21st century, which our industry partners, I think, are spending a lot of time thinking about, and we need to be catching up to those discussions and understanding how to improve our supply chains, starting from those ingredients that come out of one or two countries that we may or may not have access to in conflict, all the way through how do you operate a supply chain in a cyber-degraded, contested environment where you don't have air superiority. Those are tough problems to solve, and we've got to work on them. Picture of a robot doing robotic surgery. As a surgeon, I think that that's a remarkable technology that's come along. And the whole telehealth space is changing rapidly. How much of that is applicable in a cyber-degraded expeditionary environment? That's work still to be done. We think there's a lot that we can do with low-bandwidth telehealth to support a medic on the front lines. Can we do that same level of work with robotic surgery close to the front lines? I'm not convinced we're there yet, but we need to keep working on how do we do that when we don't have full suite of surgical capabilities, but we do have the bandwidth to support that. Picture of whole blood goes back to a comment that I made earlier. There is no question that the use of whole blood is incredibly valuable on the battlefield or in any trauma scenario. And yet, after every conflict, we wind up somehow talking ourselves out of this. And we say, well, whole blood is really hard to get, which is a true statement. And it's really hard to move, which is a true statement. And it's really hard to store, which is a true statement. So we really ought to use normal saline or lactated ringers. Let's do some thoughtful studies on looking at other substitutes for whole blood. Folks, if you disagree with this, I'd love to have that discussion. But I think the data is pretty compelling that whole blood is the best alternative for whole blood. If you can't get whole blood, then we should look at blood products, FFP and platelets. What are the constituents that we can get as far forward as possible? And if we can't do it, who are the partners that can help us do it? But let's not talk ourselves out of what we know is right and what the data tells us is right. We should be making sure we have everybody's blood type clearly identified before they deploy. And we should be actively pursuing the ability to produce blood products on demand as close to the front lines as possible. The technology is evolving rapidly in this space, and this is an area where we've got great need because the requirements are so great in what we project future wars might look like. On the lower left, picture of the COVID vaccine, great reminder for me to talk a little bit about mRNA vaccines and the great promise that they hold. But more importantly, again, back to the supply chain discussion, what are the things that we need to be working on to protect the health of the public writ large and of our service members in deployed environments? There's a lot of stuff that we forget in between public health emergencies. We've relearned it over the last 2 years. We should not require another pandemic to remind us of the value of basic public health measures or the value of immunizations. Our military has used immunizations and inoculations since George Washington was president. He was the first to require that for the Continental Army to reduce the risk of smallpox because it was decimating his force. We know this is the right thing to do. We need to continue to do work in this space and make sure that we're ready for future biological threats and that as soon as a threat is identified, we can sequence it, begin developing tests that we can rapidly field for it, begin developing therapeutics to treat those who are exposed or infected, and vaccines to protect those who may be exposed in the future. Doing that as quickly as possible is going to be part of how we mitigate those threats in the future. And then lastly, we talked a little bit about autonomous vehicles or remotely piloted vehicles. Some real tremendous potential with that going forward. A lot of work still to be done to understand how we best trade the risk of not having a medic on board with the benefit of being able to get in and move patients in a way that we cannot currently do, especially in a contested, cyber-degraded, or, God forbid, chem-bio environment. Next slide. And I'd ask you to have courage and persistence. So if you like to read, I'll commend a book to you. It's called Coral and Brass, and this is written by a Marine Corps General, Holland Dutch Smith. Now, General Smith writes a really candid book, and so if you want to have a couple of chuckles along the way, this is another good one to read. But he talks about the two greatest enemies that he faced in his career, which spanned basically World War I to the end of World War II. And he said the two greatest enemies that he fought against were the coral atolls occupied by the Japanese in World War II and the military brass, who were so focused on whatever the issue of the moment was that it was hard to get them to recognize what we needed to prepare for in the future. It's a great book that talks about how hard it is sometimes to change in our own organization. And that's not unique to the military. I mean, there's plenty of corporate stories out there, and there's plenty of communities that failed to adapt as quickly as they needed to. But we should take those hard looks at ourselves and ask ourselves, are we being agile or are we holding on to the past? Are we changing and embracing the changes in the practice of medicine? Are we preparing for the future threats that we know are out there? Or are we just preparing for Afghanistan again? Because I got to tell you, I don't think there's a real high likelihood of us going back into the sort of conflict that we've been in for the last 20 years. Everything that we're looking at looks much more like what is happening today in Ukraine than what happened over the last 20 years in Iraq or in Afghanistan. And you've got to have the courage to speak up and say, hey, you know what? We got to be doing things differently here. We've got to be willing to change. So the picture on the right there, the fellow who's getting shot is the inventor of a new bulletproof vest. He had a little difficulty finding anybody to believe in it as much as he did, so he had the courage of his convictions, and he put on his bulletproof vest, and he had someone shoot him, proving that it worked. That's the courage piece of it. You got to be willing to stand up when you believe you've got a better solution out there. The persistence piece is that picture was taken in 1927, and it was nearly 40 years until bulletproof vests were widely available across the force. It takes time sometimes in our organization to make those changes, even when we've got data showing how valuable they can be. That means we have to be persistent, professional, collegial, and collaborative in saying, you know, we could reduce the combat losses if we're better at delivering mental health care close to the front line. You know, Mr. or Mrs. Commander, we could increase your combat effectiveness if we did a better job of taking care of traumatic brain injuries and getting them back in the fight. And here's what we need to do next. We need to be speaking up about how we can help to improve what we bring to the fight to preserve the fighting force, as our Army colleagues like to say. Because what we can't do is take everyone who becomes ill and put them on an airplane and fly them out. We will not have the airplanes to do it, and will degrade the fighting force too quickly. We have to go back to what our predecessors did so well for thousands of years, which is treat as close to the front line as possible. And we are going to have the courage and the persistence to keep saying that as we evolve our capabilities. Next slide. So a couple of other thoughts here before we wrap up. Training is so important, and we have great training programs across the military. And I talked about our partnerships with our civilian institutions and partnerships with our allies. But I'm going to ask those of you in uniform in the audience there, are you doing all that you can to optimize the training within your own units? Are you really training your personnel on not just the appropriate use of tourniquets, but how to deliver blood products safely and effectively in a cyber-degraded, contested environment? Are you training our colleagues to work in a chem-bio environment? Are you really getting after the things that we know we need to be prepared for? Or are you doing what you've done for the last 5 years because that's easy and it checks the box and it allows you to report that you've done training when you do your DERS reports? I'd ask you, please go back and take a hard look at that. I've given you a laundry list of threats that we know are out there. Are you training your colleagues for them? Are you trained for them? And if you're not, what are you going to do about it? Because if you're waiting for someone to come down to tell you to do your job right, I got to tell you, you may be waiting for a while. We're a big organization. We trust you. That's why we have discussions like this, to know that just as the practice of medicine is changing and the threats are changing, you're going to have the personal integrity and commitment to great patient care that you're going to change as well. You're going to change the training that you do. You're going to change how we collectively prepare for future conflicts, because we know they're going to be very different than what we did in the past. Next slide. We've done a great job, and I'll say again, thanks to all of you who are involved. Some of you may recognize this as Balad Air Base. I took this picture from a helicopter, I think back in 2004, and it came together magnificently. Many of the people in this particular rotation came from Wilford Hall. Again, a trauma center that no longer exists and a training platform for the Air Force that no longer exists. BAMC continues to do a great job of training, but if you look at how many trauma patients we saw when we had BAMC in Wilford Hall and compare that to how many we're seeing today, it's not the same number. In fact, it's significantly lower. And if you look across our force, we need greater exposure to the sickest of the sick, whether they're medically ill patients or trauma patients. We need better simulators when we don't have the actual trauma patients to take care of. If we want to deliver the same high quality care that our predecessors and some of us delivered 20 years ago, we're going to have to do things differently than we're doing them right now. And we need your help to make those changes. Next slide. So some key take-home messages. And again, if anything that I said bothered people in the audience, I'm glad. The purpose of this talk is to hopefully help all of us realize the importance of what we do and the need for change. If you're not doing all you can to deliver great care at home, how can you possibly think you're going to be ready to deliver great care in a chem-bio environment or in a cyber-degraded environment? You've got to keep that absolute focus on delivering great care every day and asking yourself and your team, what can we do better tomorrow? That commitment to constant improvement in peacetime is going to be crucial to being able to operate in a combat environment. Because if we're constantly looking at how to do things better and how to solve problems, that will prepare us for when we're in an environment where every day we'll be challenged to do things at all. We'll be dealing with all of the problems that I just laid out for you. So start every day with, how do I do things better today than I did yesterday? Because if you can't do it incredibly well in peacetime, you're kidding yourselves if you're thinking that you can do it really well in combat. And it's a team sport. We know that. If you look at the aviation community or the nuclear industry or within medicine, we've proven time and time again that this is not a surgeon operating independently or a pharmacist working independently or a nurse working independently. Great healthcare is a team sport. And if you're not training that way, and if your day-to-day healthcare delivery doesn't focus on a team approach, you ought to ask yourself why. Because that's not good care at home, and it's certainly not going to be great care downrange. And you got to be brutally honest. If there are gaps that you're seeing in your training or clinical experience, elevate those. Make sure you're documenting those so that we know where we need to pursue other opportunities to make sure that you and your colleagues are getting the training and the experience that they need in peacetime, so you're ready for what we're asking you to do in combat. Because as I've tried to lay out for you, and maybe it's a little challenging to get into all the details in an unclassified brief, it is clear, at least to me, and I think to many of us who spend a lot of time looking at this, that the character of war is changing, not the nature of war. The nature of war hasn't changed since the dawn of time. It's about using force as a last resort to achieve national objectives. That hasn't changed. But that application of force is changing. And if any of you doubt that, look at what's happening in the Ukraine today. If any of you doubt that this is still a threat for which we must prepare, please just look at what's happening around the world today. And then look at what China's doing and what Iran and North Korea and others are doing. We don't have the luxury of wishing away our responsibility as military medics and those who support military medicine, our responsibility to be prepared for those future conflicts. And as the practice of medicine changes and the character of war changes, we must change what we're doing as well. We've got to let go of the things that worked really well in the past when there are better opportunities in the future. And for those of you who are young and cutting edge and you've got this great experience that you picked up here or article that you read, bring that forward, because I'll tell you, as someone on the far side of my career, I don't have the bandwidth to read every journal that's out there. I'm trusting that you guys are doing that and saying, hey, there's this cool thing that's happening in the Journal of Infectious Disease, or there's this great article in my subspecialty journal that lays out something that I think really could be applicable in a combat environment. And then we need to test that and understand how to incorporate that into what we do. And then we need to train so that we take that latest and greatest medical knowledge and make sure that we share it across the force. So I'll end with what I hope I've stressed throughout this brief. We've got to embrace the need for change because the world around us and the world in which we're being asked to deliver great care is changing. One of the most important ways to do that is constantly looking at how you can improve the care you're delivering at home so that you're ready to deliver great care in that contested, cyber-degraded, chem-bio environment that we think you may be asked to operate in the future. I'm so grateful for those of you who are there in the audience today for the fact that you took the time to listen to this presentation, but more importantly, that you care enough about what we do in military medicine, the great privilege that we have of caring for America's ill and injured. And I'd ask you to join me every day in looking for ways that we can do this better. Thank you so much for all you do. Thank you, more importantly, for what you're going to do differently tomorrow. God bless, and I hope to cross paths with you soon.